The question I've grown to hate more than anything is, so what do you do?
In the last few months, young people around the world have had political awakenings, economic awakenings, violent awakenings, and perhaps now most significantly of all, a massive spiritual awakening.
Every single fucking time. Not how are you, not who are you, not what are you passionate about, not what kind of person are you. No. What do you do? Where do you go to school? What do you do for work? It's like before people even decide if they want to know you, they want to know where you rank. I hate that shit. Maybe some people don't even mean anything by it, but that's what it feels like.
Now I want to begin this video by opening up and sharing a personal experience that quite literally saved my life. And I don't say this lightly, could potentially save yours too. For those of you new to the channel, I'm Philosophical Gamer, the millennial defense lawyer for Gen Z, and I started this channel because I'm a millennial who came of age right after the 2008 financial crash, and I simply find it irredeemable and unacceptable that 18 years after 2008, we still haven't fixed the economy, and Gen Z now somehow has it even worse than us millennials. And this is mainly because our narcissistic boomer parents spent 2 decades gaslighting us that the economy is fine and we just need to work harder, instead of taking personal responsibility themselves and fixing the economy that they themselves ruin. Now, when I first hit my early 20s shortly after the 2008 crash, everything in life was just incredibly difficult. I couldn't find a job despite applying to literally hundreds of places. I lived in severe poverty every day. I didn't know when my next meal would come or if I'd even have enough money to pay rent the next month. Eventually, I ended up just swallowing my pride, going on food stamps, selling my plasma, and doing clinical trials to get by. Despite how difficult of an existence that was, none of those experiences, I would say, were the absolute worst thing about my early 20s. The absolute worst thing about my early 20s can be summed up with one simple sentence. One question you inevitably get asked always in every goddamn interaction with another human being. So, what do you do for a living? Now, later on in life, I learned how to deal with this. All you gotta do is give an emphatic, unapologetic, I don't do jack shit. I don't owe my life to being a slave to a corporation. And I'm happy to see that I've empowered a lot of you to do the same thing. But when I was younger, I really just didn't know how to answer this question. And so every interaction of meeting a new person went from a casual, normal conversation to a socially engineered humiliation ritual punishment. And I'm sure every one of you out there has experienced this and knows exactly what I'm talking about. If the answer to this default inevitable question isn't something the capitalist wage slave system approves of, you're instantly punished, guilt-tripped, shamed, and humiliated. If your answer is doctor, lawyer, senior upper-level management executive director of the exploitation of other human beings, or my favorite, student, if you're young enough, then you're praised, exalted, worshipped, and ass-kissed because, well, that's your reward for being an obedient little cog to the system. If your answer is anything else, then, well, you all know what happens next. And at some point, I realized this had to be a socially engineered phenomenon. Punishing you with homelessness, poverty, and starvation isn't enough for these modern-day corporate slave masters. They also have to punish you socially and psychologically if you refuse to be a slave for their shitty low wages. And as you'll see later on, the idea of asking people what you do for a living as the very first question is a very modern capitalist phenomenon. Most people throughout history would find this very strange and unusual. This is absolutely a modern, socially engineered cultural norm specifically designed to keep you too beaten down and worn out to ever fight back. So let's circle back to what I promised in the beginning of this video. Rejecting and escaping this social cultural norm was quite literally life-saving for me, and could very well be for all of you out there as well. And this is the story and journey of how. After donating plasma and doing clinical trials for about a year, I finally managed to save up about $2,000. I know, this was at a time when $2,000 was actually a decent amount of money. I had researched online that there were several good Eastern European countries where you could live pretty comfortably off $400 to $500 per month, and so I made the bold decision to book a one-way ticket with no plan whatsoever and just hope to wing it and figure it out. A lot of people looked at this decision as risky and reckless, but the way I saw it, the way I was forced to live in the States was just as, if not far more risky and reckless. I couldn't find a job no matter how many times I tried, and my only way of surviving through selling plasma and doing clinical trials was absolutely not sustainable for my long-term health at all, especially in the great United States of America, where healthcare isn't even available for the poor. Now, for my European audience out there, I know that Europe has its own problems and it's not an economic paradise for young people either. And I learned this very quickly from the time I stepped a foot onto European soil. My first stop in Europe was a cheap hostel in Romania, where I could rent a cheap bed for $8 a night in a room with 10 other travelers. I ate 2 meals per day, some cheap Romanian pastry for $1 or $2 in the morning, and a cheap $2 to $3 kebab from a local street vendor for dinner in the evening. In total, my living expenses amounted to about $13 a day, and I had to live like this for a long time in order to stretch that $2,000 as long as possible. So in terms of my material conditions, not much actually changed from my situation in the US. I was still living in poverty, still eating the cheapest foods, still sharing a room with even more roommates, in fact. And yet, despite the fact that my material conditions were just as bad or even worse, my mental health and overall happiness when I was living in this cheap hostel in Romania did a complete 180 and improved in the most transformative way imaginable. In the US, I wasn't just poor. I was depressed and even suicidal at times on top of that. And meanwhile, this hostel experience was one of the happiest times of my life. It quite literally saved my life, and I still look back on it today with very fond memories. And the reason for this comes down to one simple difference. The hostel was the best social environment imaginable. It was a pit stop for young budget travelers from all over the world, and as a result, no one really cared what you did or how much money you made. In youth hostel culture, the very first question you asked someone wasn't, "Hey, what do you do?" It was, "Hey, where are you from?" And this change, this one small, simple change, made all the difference in the world for me. No more awkward introductions for not having a job. No more being judged, humiliated, and punished for refusing to be a slave. No more dehumanizing humiliation rituals where human beings are treated as mere sacrificial economic units. But far more important than the better treatment I received was the better treatment I learned to give back out to others. When I started off by asking someone where they're from instead of what they do, the conversation naturally shifted, and it took a totally different tune. I learned about their families, their culture, their religion, their hometown. Oftentimes, I'd make friends with them and later be able to visit them in their hometown. I learned to view people as actual, living, breathing humans with dreams, emotions, passions, and fears, and not economic units on an Excel spreadsheet. And it made me realize how perverse, shallow, and empty the entire conversation becomes when the very first question is, "What do you do for a living?" Instantly and immediately, a genuine human interaction feels like a shallow business transaction. And as the young Gen Z Chad said in the beginning of this video, you're already sizing people up as a potential connection, a business partner, an economic transaction, before you even get to know them as a human being. And this was the beginning of an upwards virtuous cycle that was literally a lifesaver. Others saw me not as an economic unit, but as a fellow young traveler still finding himself and figuring life out. And as a real human being, I then was able to do the same for others. And this not only lifted me out of my personal depression and loneliness, but I was able to build the necessary social skills, confidence, and assertiveness to turn my life around. It's the reason I was able to survive all those years and eventually be able to start this YouTube channel even. Hey guys, we noticed something very interesting in the YouTube analytics recently. It appears that the single most important metric for the long-term success of a video isn't actually likes or clicks, it's actually how many people end up subscribing. So, if you found this video important and useful, the best thing you can do to help us get the message out is to simply subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you all so much, guys. We really, truly appreciate it. And I just can't help but wonder if this simple cultural shift of asking just a different question the first time you meet someone made such a difference for me in one small youth hostel. What would happen if we were to spread the spiritual awakening throughout the entire world? Well, fortunately for us, this might actually be a lot easier than it sounds. We've talked a lot about revolutionary change on this channel. Political revolutions, economic revolutions, even violent revolutions at times. But perhaps the most powerful and simultaneously also the easiest revolution to pull off would be a spiritual revolution. Political revolutions are messy and can take years to implement real change. Violent revolutions have obvious severe consequences, which is why I refuse to call for one, despite some of my audience clamoring for it. But a spiritual revolution that changes the very way we treat our fellow human beings, we could honestly start this instantly, with no money or resources required, no need to risk our lives in a violent revolution, and all it takes really is a simple mindset shift. The next time you meet someone, or even reconnect with people you already know, simply ask them a question other than the corporate generic, "So, what do you do?" Ask them, what do you like to do for fun? What are your hobbies and passions? What do you want to make out of this life? Or, I don't know, even come up with your own good questions to kick off the conversation. We're all clearly sick of the way things are right now. Not just the economy, not just the impossible job market and absurd inflation, although those are undoubtedly huge problems we have to deal with as well. But it's also the sheer brainwashed psychological heartlessness we've all been conditioned to treat each other with. It's bad enough that these asshole corpos and our delusional boomer parents treat us as nothing more than an economic unit on a spreadsheet. But this capitalist brainwashing is so pervasive that to some level, we even do this to each other, even if it's subconscious and unintentional. And here's perhaps the most important thing about all of this. Oftentimes, economic and political change actually follow cultural, spiritual change first. There's a massive reckoning going on in American politics right now, with Democratic quote-unquote socialist candidates gaining even more power now. I use the term socialist very loosely here because even the most radical socialist in America is extremely economically conservative by global and historical standards. But this new political revolution didn't come out of nowhere. It happened after years of Gen Z completely changing social and cultural views around the idea of work and productivity. Within a few short years, you guys turned the 9 to 5 from a symbol of pride into a joke and a meme. You turned the idea of climbing the corporate ladder that boomers were once proud of into a modern representation of being a corporate slave. Once people start rejecting the underlying cultural expectations, political and economic change almost always eventually follows. And this life-changing cultural shift can begin with one simple question. Just one simple change in the way you meet people. Next time you meet someone for the first time, instead of asking them what they do, ask them literally anything else. Anything that would help you deprogram from this toxic capitalist culture we've been brainwashed with. Anything that would help you see the other person as a real human being and not a number, a title to be exploited for corporate profits. And in a few years, maybe even less, if we get to a point where the social norm is not to ask someone what their job is at the very first question, I just get the feeling that we would be in a much, much better place and living in a much, much more pleasant world.
Tall forever.
So the whole construct of what's your job, how do you make a living, doesn't really apply to ancient Egypt. This is a very modern way of understanding what professions are and how we work in the world.
So this last clip right there was of a professional Egyptologist debunking a bunch of AI slop videos on ancient Egypt, and the part you just saw right there was very, very eye-opening to me. Whenever we talk about making political and economic changes, we get gaslit by delusional boomers and corporate chills that we're just a bunch of radical, entitled communists and socialists, that the current status quo is just the way it always has been, and thus the way it always has to be. And yet the more and more I research and look into history, the more I realize that this just straight up isn't the case. If anything, this current boomer neoliberal status quo of your job defining your entire worth as a human being by your job title is what would actually truly be considered insane, radical, and ridiculous by most wise people throughout history. As you just saw, ancient Egyptians wouldn't know or care what your job is. The idea of a specialized, repetitive job was completely unheard of back then. Greeks and Romans viewed work with even more disgust than Gen Z anti-work subreddits today. The word for work in Latin was literally neg odium. Odium meaning fun or leisure, and neg being the negative prefix in Latin, like non or not in English today. Think about that for a second. They didn't call it work, they called it non-leisure. They viewed work as the annoying, sometimes necessary thing you had to do to get out of the way, while leisure time was seen as the ultimate goal. Today, we always tell ourselves we're not being productive if we're not working. We've been brainwashed to feel like we're wasting time when we do the things we enjoy. But the Greeks and Romans viewed it the exact opposite. Work was the waste of time. Leisure and enjoyment was time well spent. And judging from how sick and depraved our society has become over money, I'd say the Greeks and Romans definitely beat out modern-day delusional boomers on this point. Classical Hinduism looked at life through a lens of four main pillars: Dharma being duty, Artha being wealth and prosperity, Kama being love and enjoyment, and finally, Moksha being freedom. Now notice how they aren't delusional here. They know that you need money to survive, and thus they do have financial wealth and prosperity as one of the four main pillars. But that's kind of the point. It's one of many factors that contribute to a life well lived. It's not the singular, ultimate, exclusive, end-all be-all that determines your entire identity as a human being the way these neoliberal capitalists want it to be. And they specifically say that these four pillars must be kept in harmony and balance. If any single one overcrowds the other three, it's just a disaster, and we've all seen and lived through that at this point. So let's finish off this video by starting off this awakening in the very comment section below. Tell us something about yourself that isn't what you do as a job. Where are you from? What are your goals? What are your dreams, passions, and hobbies? What do you hope to get out of this life? I very much look forward to hearing your answers, and I will see you all in the next video.